Hey, everybody. We're getting back to the speaking program. If y'all can hear me in the back, I encourage you to come forward. Come and join us here in our very fancy lecture hall. Our next speaker, Will North. He's a cultural worker and a community historian based here in Houston, Texas. Through his writings and visual art, he explores intergenerational dialogues and shared spaces. He's particularly interested in the intellectual traditions represented by art of the African diaspora. Will develops curriculum and workshops as a mentor in the Musafa's Pride Rites of Passage program for young men. He's worked with children of all ages as a volunteer art history instructor in area schools. He has researched the visual art tradition at Texas Southern University for several years and has led mural tours on the campus, and you really ought to go if you have not seen the murals of Hannah Hall and in the museum over at TSU. It's what I bring my visitors to go see when they come to Houston. He's also, Will's first solo exhibition, currently on view at the Anderson Center for the Arts. Amazing. Congrats. Also exhibiting with some of the former TSU muralists at the African American Research Center at the Gregory School. He serves on the boards of the Sankofa Collective Theater, Houston, the Healing Academy of Chicago, Illinois, and the Black Cowboy Coalition. Everybody, please put your hands together for Will North.
Hey, thank you. Oh, and I left my shades up too. Okay. Oh, put it up. Okay, thank you. Hey. So, thank you for that, Pete. So, again, I'll introduce myself. I just want to add, again, my name is Will North, cultural worker, community historian based in Houston, Texas. And, apparently I chase dead people. All right, so, or at least according to my great aunt, that's what I do. I got into a conversation with her maybe a couple of weeks ago about our family history, about the importance of it. And I'm just thrilled to be in a space like this where I can be around and share space with people who find these kinds of stories, these histories, interesting and engaging, think that it's important. Because when I was talking to my great aunt, she's the oldest living relative on my paternal side. She's my grandfather's younger sister. And when I began to ask her questions about the family only a few years ago, she said, well, baby, I never spent a lot of time chasing dead people. I have too many problems with the living. But when I love sharing spaces with y'all, I'm reminded of why this is so important and urgent. And so I'm here to present some work that I do along the lines of the archives of what I call an independent black print tradition. And so I'm going to avoid the pitfalls of this character, Cimbee, but I'm really here to discuss Cimbee's ramblings and what Cimbee represents as part of a larger tradition of the trickster in African American folklore. And as I said, I like to research this independent black tradition because it gave people an opportunity to present a counter-narrative. Now, those of us who love looking at newspapers and periodicals, we often hear that newspapers are the first draft of history, that they're a space where we can see what the people of the time valued. And they let us know what's worth remembering. And so as I put in the slide deck, just these black newspapers, there's a long tradition in the United States and around the world of black people getting together and using these newspapers, using these periodicals to counter dehumanizing representations of them by the larger media outlets. Some famous journalists that you might have heard of, Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, Marcus Garvey. But I'm here to talk about Texas and how Texas is kind of situated in that larger narrative. So, and I'm focusing particularly on the Houston Informer and the colorful characters that were created. But first I want to talk about the New Negro movement. Often it's associated with what people contemporarily call the Harlem Renaissance, this broad cultural flowering that's generally associated with Harlem in New York or Bronzeville in Chicago. But again, there were people all over the country that were writing, that were creating art, that were creating music. And again, I was interested in what was happening in Texas at that time. And again, this time is generally associated with the 1920s, with the Jazz Age, with, again, soldiers coming back from World War I, especially the black servicemen who wanted to assert their power, their humanity, and they weren't going to take no as an answer in regards to their civil and equal rights. So just want to say Houston was a thriving center for this community. There were black communities in really all of the historic wards, but in particular, 4th Ward, or Freedmanstown, was a center. It had a number of businesses, a number of schools, independent organizations that really were unique, but they had more than most of the other cities in the country, and that was something that was kind of a revelation to me because, again, my family's from Houston, but I have a lot of elders who say that I'm chasing dead people, so they don't talk about the past as much. And so to learn that there was a thriving community here that in many cases they had more businesses than Tulsa, Greenwood, some of these other spaces that are often called Black Wall Streets, which I have a problem with, but these so-called Black Wall Streets. Houston had, again, a thriving business district. And I do want to draw your attention to Tawana Steptoe. She's a scholar at the University of Arizona. She wrote a fantastic book called Houston Bound, where she speaks to the history of Houston, but also the migration that was happening here. Not just of Anglo-Americans or African-Americans, but also Hispanic-Americans, and how these populations came together to create the diversity that we have today. And she pays particular attention to the rural to urban migration. Now, what you're seeing before you, Heavenly Houston, this was an advertisement, really a promotional tool by black newspapers of the time. The gentleman that I'm going to talk about, a couple of journalists today, but one is C.F. Richardson, who founded the Houston Informer in 1919. So this is actually something he published called Heavenly Houston, and he really acted as a booster for the city. Now keep in mind, us history buffs know that, okay, 1919, what was happening in Houston in 1917? There was a Camp Logan massacre, right? But again, he was positioning Houston as this, almost a city on the hill. Because again, there were a lot of jobs that were available to people. There were opportunities for self-determination, for you to buy a house, similar today, for you to, there was relatively affordable housing, relatively affordable land, and some autonomy. There was a degree of freedom that people found in Houston that they didn't find in rural Texas as much, or as working as sharecroppers. So there's a lot of freedom for people, during this time period. Just to give some other information, again, the population of Houston in total at this time was 140,000, okay? This isn't New York City. It wasn't the thriving fourth largest city in the nation back then, but it was certainly on the rise. And then it grew to a population of just under 300,000 by 1930. But there was, in a historical context, we often hear about the Great Migration up north by African Americans. But there's also a great migration throughout the South to other major cities in the South. So you see migrations to Atlanta, New Orleans, and Houston. And there's a particularly large population of people that traveled and moved to Houston, made their home there. And in my writing, I focus primarily on migrations from East Texas and from Louisiana because I have my family lines pretty much they migrated from Louisiana and East Texas. That's why I'm here. I also want to focus on how the communities were constructed because it's not a foregone conclusion that a thriving community will take place. It takes people, it takes individuals, it takes people coming together to develop the spaces that we live in, both physically and spiritually. Of course, the church was a major center of African American life. That was the case back then, and many of the communities kind of emerged around and developed around the church. So we're finally at Texas, getting them told a Texas tradition. So I wanted to, again, I'm chasing dead people. Clifton Richardson is one of them. He launched the Houston Informer in 1919. He was the one who was boasting of Heavenly Houston. He was a major booster of the city. He founded his newspaper with a local, he received funding from a local black millionaire at the time. But he advocated for self-help. He was an example of what was called a new Negro. He was certainly advocating for his rights and the rights of his community. He was also agitating for social change. He was not afraid to chastise and criticize the Ku Klux Klan and leadership within the city of Houston that enabled them. Because what we'll find, even though historically we talk about the Jazz Age and Harlem Renaissance and all the sexy images that conveys, it was also the time of a rise in the Ku Klux Klan, and there was kind of a rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan during that time. Membership of the Ku Klux Klan grew immensely. So, again, Clifton Richardson received death threats, but he wasn't working for anybody, so he felt that he had the economic independence to do what he wanted to do and say what he wanted to say. He also chastised black leaders who weren't forceful enough in fighting Jim Crow laws. So Clifton Richardson, his motto was getting them told. That's what he put in his newspapers. And he was a Texan, he was from Texas, and he was going to let you know. And so one of my favorite quotes from C.F. Richardson is actually a quote that I used in my exhibition that's up right now because I just enjoyed it so much. So to give you a bit more context, he was a younger man at that time. Let's say we're talking about the 1920s. He's born in the 1890s. He would have, there was definitely tension between him and older generations. So people as part of the New Negro movement, they really emphasized, again, their autonomy, self-determination, and fighting for their rights. He was not content to sit by and allow anyone to ignore that battle. And if he felt that you as a leader, as a black minister even, if you weren't fighting in the same way, he was going to get you told, and he did it in the newspaper. So this was one of the quotes that he that I used in my exhibition because it was funny to me. But he, again, chastised the local minister. He told him that minister is a pussyfooting pulpit pimp. As they're taking the money of the people and they're not advocating for our rights. What are you here for? It doesn't matter if you are a leader or if you're black. He's going to get you told. And with that, Cimbee arrives. So talked about Houston Informer, we talked about C.F. Richardson, and now I want to get into Cimbee, the protagonist of our story, really. So Cimbee is really a play on the name of Simeon B. Williams. He was an educator in Houston. He was also a writer and journalist for the Houston Informer. And he focused on the city of Houston. He was another person that was called a race man of the era. So people who took pride in their community and culture, they were called race women, race men. And he certainly epitomized that. He's from East Texas, and similarly, Cimbee was from East Texas, was from Marshall, Texas. And part of his column was writing letters back to his family and his friends in East Texas, because he was a recent migrant. And I'm particularly interested in what Simeon B. Williams does with language. As a migrant, he was well educated. I'm talking about Simeon B. Williams. He was real educated for the time. He taught. He epitomized this new Negro, this person who forcefully and complexly articulated their desires, their rights, and fought for self-determination. Cimbee, on the other hand, spoke in a different kind of dialect, one that I think speaks to the tensions between the bourgeois, and the labor, the larger labor pool that was there. The recent migrant. So in my research, I look at Cimbee as a representation of the recent migrant to Houston. There were thousands and thousands of people who moved from the rural to the urban and had to adjust to city life. Now, this is Houston of 100 years ago, so it's a lot different, but it's also very similar, right? They're forced to find housing. They're forced to find work. And Simeon B. Williams was speaking to that. He was wrestling with the idea of these stereotypes. And what I find so interesting is he was playing with some of the very language that was used in stereotypical fashion against black people of the era, of that time. He spoke, again, his character Cimbee spoke in, kind of a vernacular that would have been familiar to their audience, but could have caused somebody like a C.F. Richardson to feel a bit ill, because he wanted to represent this certain kind of manhood, this certain kind of respectability. But to my surprise, C.F. Richardson was a strong proponent of what Simeon B. Williams was doing. And so, hold on, let me go back. All right. And so one of the questions I want us to ask, and one of the questions I've been asking is, what does Cimbee do well? Because we're still having this conversation around respectability 100 years later. What is it appropriate to put into the public sphere? Because this newspaper ultimately becomes one of the most widely circulated black newspapers in the state of Texas. So there's this expression that a lot of my elders would make about showing other people our dirty laundry. Well, Cimbee speaks to that. C.F. Richardson speaks to that. But I'm interested in the kind of tensions that we can see expressed in that newspaper, in that periodical of the day. Also, and I think when we think about what Cimbee does well, we have to acknowledge the trickster in the gods. And just as some background, tricksters are prominently expressed in many African and African-American folklore in that tradition. So one of the things they do is they critique the power structures. As we saw in the previous presentation, it can be challenging. Imagine if you are not part of the royal class and you're critiquing the royal class. Depending on what society you live in, you could be put to death. And while they weren't putting as many people to death 100 years ago, there is a bit of danger in speaking truth to power. Well, the trickster tradition, the tradition that we see with somebody like a Brer Rabbit, those were characters who may not have been as powerful physically or had as much in the form of resources, but they were able to chastise and critique the power structure. And they did it often through language, through the way they used language, through the way they used metaphor. they were able to trick the person in power while also calling them out. So they could call you on your BS, but then but as part of the culture of the time, you wouldn't suffer the deadly consequences. And so I do want to show a couple of slides of what Cimbee talked about, because again, Cimbee wasn't afraid to talk about anything, and he did talk about any and everything. First, I want to start with Cimbee and community building. So again, as I said, he wrote about, he wrote to his friends in East Texas. And one of the things that he would do, or one of the things I find so interesting is he would highlight businesses in his columns, in his opinion columns. So he was in the opinion section of the Houston Informer, and he would go and ramble. I don't know if anyone can read that, but the way it's set up, he's talking about, Lieutenant Frank Lane. Again, he's talking about people who returned from World War I, and again, using some of the language of the time. This person who cut up so many Huns in no man's land that to keep in practice, he come home and straight away opened a cut-rate grocery store. So he went from talking about somebody cutting up Huns, in World War I, to starting a grocery store that provided affordable groceries for you. And then he talks about my broke-footed friend Jim Williams, about other bargains that are available to you. So one of the things it does is it establishes space and place in Houston. So if you're reading that newspaper, and again, this newspaper is circulated far and wide, if you're reading that newspaper, okay, I don't know Houston, but, I can read Cimbee's ramblings, and he's talking about the theater I can go to that's safe to go to, or a pharmacy that I can check out, a grocery store I can visit. Oh, and this one is funny. Cimbee and race. Again, he talked about everything. And so there were some derisive terms used for older African Americans during this time, certainly. One was uncle. So an older man would typically be called uncle. A younger man might be called boy. And this is Cimbee in his response when he's referred to as an uncle by an Anglo-American from Houston. And he said, I ain't got no nephews that I remember that belongs to that particular race. But I must have been his uncle because he said so, and I don't like to argue with kinfolk. So that was the way he played with language to, again, highlight the absurdity of it all, right? The person he's interacting with doesn't know him, is not related to him at all, but that was just something that people were called at that time because they didn't often, again, they weren't called Mr. They weren't given the respect of being called Mr. So we'll just call this older person uncle. Because we're in the South, so it's a way of showing respect. It's so absurd when I read it. It's funny to me, but it's a way of showing respect because this person, I can't call this elderly man a boy, so I'm just going to call him uncle. Now, I can't call you Mister. Okay. But this is also funny. So Cimbee closes this same letter with a reflection on names and racial hierarchy. So he said, that ain't all. At the end, and again, these are long, long columns, because again, it's Cimbee, he's rambling, right? That's the whole point of it. He said, that ain't all. Before I got to our office, I was called Cap and George. I guess they meant George Washington, since I had got so old lately. Now you see why I don't know who or what I am, boy. Boy, uncle, Cap, and George, all in one short day. Whomsoever I contend, I am just plain old Cimbee. And do want to draw your attention to the idea of George. So especially during this time, this one was written in 1919. I don't know how many people are familiar with the Pullman Porters or Pullman cars or anything like that. Okay, so Pullman, the Pullman sleepy cars were the organization was founded by George Pullman. Okay, and so there was this tendency for a number of passengers to refer to the African American men working on those as porters on those cars, on those trains, as George or Georgie boy or something to that nature. So again, it's something that's really specific to the time because again, they're referring to George Pullman, so they just call everybody that worked there George, all the black people George. I don't know your name. I don't feel like learning your name. You're just George. So there's this thing where they would call people George. It made me laugh. And Cimbee's laughing, right? It's this idea that you're laughing to keep from crying at the absurdity of it all. So he talked about race in these humorous ways. Cimbee and prohibition. So everybody familiar with the 18th Amendment? Okay, well, Cimbee talked about that too. All right, so this one's written in 1919. And so again, there's World War I that ends in 1918 for the U.S. Many of the soldiers are pulled out, and they begin returning in 1918 and 1919. They get pulled out around that time. So there's a lot that goes on there, but in this particular column, he's focusing specifically on prohibition. He's always advertising. He's always promoting local businesses, always black-owned grocery stores, pharmacies. He's very much a race man, even if he won't admit it. But with the Cimbee and prohibition, I just thought this was cute. At the end, he said, those po' boys. And so there's this thing that he does with rhyming, because we call the World War I veterans doughboys, right? So before I put that quote in there, he's also talking about the doughboys, and he goes from doughboys to po' boys. Po' boys, I'm so sorry for them, because they is headed for a land that every day in every way is getting drier and drier. So, he wants his drink too. I don't know, how am I looking for time, Pete? I just want to make sure I'm not. Okay, cool. Okay, yeah. Cimbee and prohibition. All right, and then Cimbee and equality. So, just as some more background, 1919 is referred to as kind of this bloody summer of 1919. There were unprecedented race riots throughout the country. Some particularly well-known ones are the race riot in Chicago in 1919. There's one in Washington, D.C., one in New York. Numerous examples of just disturbances. And a lot of that is attributed to these soldiers coming back, especially in how it's looked at, how it's historicized. Many historians attribute that to many of the black servicemen coming back. They've experienced the opportunity to fight in war, but there was this idea that you're fighting for your country and you're fighting for democracy globally, then you should receive those same rights at home, right? You shouldn't have to fight at home for the rights. This is your homeland. And so there were tensions that came with that. On top of that, there weren't enough jobs for the service people, period. So there was tensions, it was hot, air conditioning wasn't widely available in 1919, and people were fighting back. And particularly in 1919, there were a number of battles, a number of examples where these black soldiers were fighting back. And I do want to draw your attention to the Camp Logan riot of 1917, because many people see that as a precursor to what would happen in 1919. That was when, just as some background, that was when a number of black servicemen were based in Houston, Texas, near what's Memorial Park today. There aren't a lot of markers to it, but there was an incident where a police officer was assaulting a black woman. There were soldiers that were in the area. The soldiers were asking why. These soldiers were in that community. They're asking, why are you doing this? They wanted to get some answers. The police officer was shocked that this black man would have the audacity to question what he was doing as he was beating a woman upside her head. And so then it grew so he started beating the soldier. Well, news got back to Camp Logan, and the soldiers marched on the city. And, I think a number of people were killed. And again, it's been historicized as this was an example of the new Negro waking up, and they weren't going to, again, allow themselves to just be treated any old kind of way, this generation. But Simbee's going to bring humor, and there's this tradition of bringing humor within unspeakable tragedy. And that's what he's kind of wrestling with here. And so he's talking about how he stops a race riot. But he's not talking about humans, he's talking about chickens. So he's talking about He's talking about the white chickens and the black chickens fighting each other and how he stops it. So he said, "Why, man, I stopped a race riot all by my lonesome, unassisted and unescorted. Yes, sirree, it was some riot, just like most of them race riots, that the daily paper's been running such big headlines about." And so at the end, he makes this statement: what right does the black to expect the same kind of justice, the same kind of equality? So it's funny because, again, if I could show you how long his columns are, they're very long, and he's rambling. But there's always this line of truth that he puts in there where he's critiquing this system that he's living within. But again, while I am interested in dead people, I'm also interested in the ideas. And the fact that this is a living tradition is something that I really like to focus on in my writing and my work as a cultural worker, particularly with the next generation. So there are a couple of questions there are a lot of questions that I have. We might ask that question 100 years ago, and we can still ask that question today. How do we get our news? And what is newsworthy? Right? That whole idea of first draft of history. Many of us get our news from social media, from all kinds of sources. Some of the time, and many of the time, it can be journalists that aren't independent. Again, there's numerous sources. How effective are existing structures for transmitting culture? And one of the things I love about Cimbee as a character is he really helped with community building. He was letting you know the places to go. Like literally every week he had a column, so he would tell you if a new film was being shown at the Black-owned theater, this is where you go to see the film. And they showed all kinds of films there. There's some I would love to, if anybody's interested, I'd love to share with you some of the things that I took out of the presentation. But it was about the movies of the day. You can really get a feel for what was popular in silent film, if any cinema buffs out there. But silent film, he's talking about silent film and why he didn't like it. He gives critiques of films. Cimbee gives critiques of films. And he also gives his views on theology. So Cimbee does a lot. He does a lot of rambling. Also, how can old media be utilized to articulate contemporary reality? So that's something I'm really interested in because I do a lot of work with young people, with teenage boys. I'm also interested in what should be retained and what must be discarded. There are a lot of views that I think are very, very helpful from the past, but there's also things that could be discarded. You can list them. I think one of the issues that some of my elders have is there's so much that they dislike about the past that they just want to throw everything away, but there's so much good there too. And is there room for Cimbee today? And then if there is, how would he look? What would he look like? How will we be able to spread information in the same way, or not necessarily in the same way, but with the same force as the Houston Informer 100 years ago? So still getting them told. I'm interested in ephemera. I'm interested in hierarchies and privilege, and I'm interested in the role that independent journalism plays in all of this, right? How do we continue to foster curiosity and critical thinking within young people, within young minds? And so, as Pete mentioned, I work in a rites of passage program for young men. It's a mentoring program for teenage boys. And so one of the things we did was we're showing them how to access the archive. I mean, there's a lot of things that we do, but one of the things I wanted to focus on this year was getting them out into their community. Every year we raise money for us to travel to different cities, and we place a particular emphasis on sites of memory for the African American community, but we go, again, everywhere. So we'll go see the Washington Monument, but then we'll also go to Ben's Chili Bowl, for example, or Howard University, or some place like that to see sites specifically oriented around our memory. But I realize that so many people are from Houston. They may have been born and reared here, but they're not familiar with all these amazing sites. And so one I want to draw your attention to is the African American Research Library at the Gregory School. It's in the 4th Ward, and it was the one of the first schools for African American children. But it's become a library. It's been repurposed and it's become and revitalized, and it's become they have a great archive. And so I go there to access information, but I wanted to bring the young men there too. So he's looking at a book, and they were kind enough to give us a tour. And so again, we went on a tour of Freedmanstown. And again, one of the ways that I think we can draw attention to the past is sharing those stories and finding innovative ways of sharing the stories. So I'm interested in media, social media, older media like formerly newspapers, all of that. And then, just again, taking action. This is example of some of the work that I do. I also make larger pieces that, again, I look at the digitized archive. Oh, what? It's not, oh my gosh. Okay, thank you. Oh, no, you're okay. Oh, that's okay. Okay, yeah, so thank you. Okay, so again, when I speak with the young men, I'm fascinated about intergenerational dialogues. How do we engage young minds, especially following the pandemic and everyone looking at their phones? How do we really engage kids in this new climate? It may require us to pivot, but we have to be courageous when we do it. And so that's in closing. That's just a shot of us outside the Gregory School. But one of the things I want to leave you all with is, again, my name is Will North. I chase dead people, according to my great aunt. But as I was talking to her, I realized I don't know that I chase dead people. I try to honor the dead, but more importantly, I chase ideas. And I think these ideas are examples of possibilities that are alive and well. And we just have to look a little deeper, study a little longer, and we can imagine and execute and cultivate a better world. So I want to thank you all for your time, and I hope you have a good day.